Introduce myself. My name is Luke Hampson, the Innovation Outreach Manager at Geovation, and today we're here for our third panel session, positive impact panels that we're running at Geovation, and this covering today the digital planning sustainable towns and cities. So just for those that weren't on the call before I said this a few minutes ago, essentially we are hoping to put your name in the chat, where you're coming from today, where you're actually located, the organisation. It'd be good to try and get some chat going on there in the chat functionality here on Teams. And in terms of housekeeping, we're very much on a Teams call, so please do keep yourselves on mute and keep the cameras off as attendees, please. That would be great. Okay, so I'm going to kick into the intro now before introducing our panel, or letting the panelists introduce themselves. And then we'll get round to the nitty-gritty of the questions that we've got for them. So, yeah, a warm welcome to this, our third positive impact panel here at Geovation. In this episode, we're exploring the developments in geospatial user industries, focusing the lens this time on digital planning. So as digitalisation sweeps across the world, it comes as no surprise that the planning process is shifting towards the use of digital platforms too. This promises increased efficiency, reduced costs, and greater levels of citizen engagement in the planning process. The global drive towards digitalisation was initially fuelled by the need for more efficient processes, cost reductions, and collaboration. No doubt, though, the pandemic has accelerated this shift through necessitating remote work and digital collaboration as examples. Technologies like machine learning, AI, can process data at ever-increasing rates. You know, the integration of geographic information systems and location data provides spatial understanding and visual analysis capabilities. Digital twins, the virtual models of towns and cities, are enabling simulations and scenario planning. And Earth observation, the data and tech behind that, can enable tracking and land use changes over time. These are just some of the examples and the tools that are used by planners over the country and beyond. And they're innovations that we at Geovation also look to nurture. Our mission at Geovation is about bringing people together to unlock their potential and addressing challenges and opportunities for positive impact, where geospatial data is one of the ingredients in addressing those challenges and opportunities. We're 14 years old this month actually at Geovation. It was launched back in 2009, and since that time, we've actively supported 150 startups. Excuse me. When I say actively, we've actually funded those startups and supported them with technical resource and business development capability too. Out of those 150 startups, there are around 170 million they've raised in funding since they've been through our programs. So quite a successful initiative. But it's more than just that at Geovation. It's about our wider community. That's where really things come to life. We have around 1,800 community members currently, and ultimately they come from startup founders, from anything up to kind of key players within industry too. So, and everything in between. So it's a real mix of an ecosystem that we have. And if you're interested in joining us, please do. You know, we have, I'm sure my colleagues will pop that into the chat, the link to join Geovation's member. There are no hooks, and ultimately you're able to connect with a lot of geospatially and PropTech focused community members there. So it's a community, as I've mentioned. It's open to all, including startups, SMEs, corporates, academia. We have 3 accelerator programs that we run at Ordnance Survey. One on PropTech, which is in partnership with the HM Land Registry, and one on Geotech, which is a OS funded, the OS lead Geovation, but that's the track that OS is specifically focused on. And of course, then we have a Geotech and PropTech track that we run through Geovation Scotland for those entrepreneurs north of the border. We also have our hub in London, which is a co-working space, as well as a place that we incubate those businesses on the programme and more. As well as our partner hub network around the country. So it's not all just about London, it's about our 6 partner hubs that we have dotted around GB. Lastly, we have an in-house tech team as well as a business development team, which really add to our USP as part of the Geovation offering. So Without further ado, I've kind of gone over the housekeeping. I'm just going to repeat it one more time. Please do keep your cameras off in terms of the audience, on mute if you could. And we are recording this call for wider dissemination on YouTube afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists we have and let them introduce themselves. So I'm going to come firstly to Bridget Wilkins, who's the head of digital systems engagement at DLUC. So Bridget, if you'd just like to introduce yourself, your roles and responsibilities there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Luke, and great to join this panel session today. I'm Bridget Wilkins, Head of Digital Citizen Engagement at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. It's quite a mouthful, that title, but what it means in practice is that I work across a brilliant team in the digital planning program, where we're overseeing the largest planning reform and system change in over 60 years, and looking at how we can both support the adoption and the design and development of a range of digital tools and solutions in the planning process. And my specific focus is the delivery of the PropTech Innovation Fund, which to date has invested in over 52 local authorities at last count in a range of projects in the consultation process, which I'm sure we'll talk about throughout this panel discussion.
That's great. Thanks, Bridget, and welcome. Next, we have a couple of our startups that have been or are currently on our Geovation programme. First, come to yourself, Dr. Wei Yang, the CEO of Digital Task Force for Planning. Would you just like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Luke. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Wei Yang. I'm co-founder and the CEO of the Digital Task Force for Planning. I think many of you know Digital Task Force for Planning as an independent expert panel we set up in 2021. Last year, we have incorporated the task force as a social enterprise, an innovation-led social enterprise. So our focus is really focus on how we can apply digital innovation into mainstream planning practice and education to focus on systematic changes in spatial planning. And we have been selected as one of the startups in the new cohort for spring 2023. And we are the first social enterprise to be selected in the Geovation Accelerator program. But we are not directly funded, but we have been receiving lots of support. It really shows another kind of need to see how we can kind of renovate the innovation model and also the startup program as well. Really nice to see you.
Fantastic, Wei. Thank you very much for that introduction and welcome. And Ewan, over to you, the founder of BlockType.
Yeah, thanks, Luke, and good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Ewan, co-founder of BlockType. We're an application which helps people understand what you can build where and how much for. I'm a planner and an urban designer by background, and I've been involved in the digital kind of planning world for about kind of 6 years or so now as well. I helped set up the team that Bridget is working on at DLUC. I advise the Scottish Government in planning. And I've done kind of a number of other projects in the area, and yeah. So I'm coming from this world where I kind of helped think and kind of conceive a lot of the kind of the infrastructure, the stuff that government's doing, etc. And now kind of on the startup side, kind of building my own company.
That's great. Thank you, Ewan. And last but no means least, Richard Limbrick from London Borough of Camden as planning manager. Welcome, Richard. Introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm Richard Limbrick. I'm a manager at Camden in the planning department, so I manage a team of planners there. But I've had quite a long-running interest in kind of digital innovation, service improvement things, and stuff like that. So when was involved in some of the initial funding which DLUC put out for digital innovation projects in kind of public sector, and so was involved in some of those earlier kind of bids. And then since then, I've been overseeing various projects in Camden, been involved in some bits and pieces, including some of the stuff that kind of like that Ewan's been working on as well. And have now, with government funding use, managed to set up like a digital planning team in Camden. So we've got a team of planners whose job it is to be kind of work on digital. which is really good. Work closely with colleagues in our digital and our IT team as well, with funded posts there. So so now I sort of oversee that as well as managing a team of planners. Yeah, so and happy to be here today. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Richard. Okay, so without further ado, we are going to get on to the questions now. The questions are in kind of three broad buckets around importance, barriers, and innovation. Okay, so we're going to cover the first sort of bracket there around importance. And the question is, and I'm going to put this one to you first, Richard. So considering the rapid shift towards a digital-first approach across many industries, could you elaborate on the specific impacts and benefits that digitization and digitalisation bring to the UK planning industry? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, I mean, I've been in planning for like 20 years now, and I remember coming in when it was all like a big deal that we were digitizing our records and kind of scanning our records so we didn't have to look through microfiches and things like that. And we sort of like look back on that, I think, sometimes, and think about how archaic that was. But that was a massive step. That meant that suddenly records became a lot easier to find. They were accessible to people, accessible to members of the public. They started to be published on the web as kind of like just as a general, as kind of made generally accessible to people. And that had a huge change. Actually, it gave the capacity for greater kind of engagement. I think there are a load of other barriers to engagement. I'm sure like Bridget will come in on this. So there's like loads of issues around that, but that was a massive impact actually, I think. And I think it's clearly a big benefit to it because it kind of paved the way for what we're trying to do now with the more digitalization of actually kind of thinking, well, actually let's start now thinking around this as data and let's extract it as data and not have to just try and pull things out of scans and PDFs and so on. So I think that's been like a huge impact for it, and we've continued to progress with that for now. I mean, there is like a move towards generally more open data now. People are publishing it. I think like Camden does it. We publish our open data records. We've got an open data portal. It has APIs with it, so people can just connect to it and make things with it, which they do. So we've got local community groups that have their own little interactive planning maps that they've developed online. So that's a huge step. And I think the impact now is that we are starting to emerge with things like data standards coming out, which is, GLA's done a lot of work on this. And then Ewan and his team, when he was with Paul Downey's team in Central Gov, done a huge amount of work in trying to coordinate these emerging data standards. And I think that's really beneficial as well. Not only does it mean that we can start to have kind of consistency from our own monitoring purposes and our own understanding of it, it also helps to make it more accessible again, because it means that people are looking at the same thing again and again. They're not looking at a different thing in every area, and people don't think in, local planning authority boundaries like we think like that, or I do because I'm a local authority planner. Normal people don't think like that. So so having that standardized structure and way of being able to access information has been really, really important.
Great, thanks, Richard. I'm going to bring Wei in there if you'd like to add your thoughts on that question, please.
Yes, I think it's actually very interesting you put digitization and digitalization into your question. So I want to clarify the concept. For me, I think digitization is digitize the current system, but digitalization is think about a different methodology where you can think about how you can use the digital tools and also big data to transform the planning methodology. So I think there are fundamental difference between these two words. And the planning is primarily about people, nature, and the society. So thinking about the relationship between them, is such a comprehensive subject, and then it's normally beyond anybody's ability to consider all the different factors together. And then planning is really about people, our society. So I think the advantage of digitalization is enable us to have access to big data and also enormous amount of information and the knowledge to really help us to inform evidence-based decision-making process. And then all the other scientific advice, for example, advancement on climate impact, on biodiversity, on people's behavior, and then we can capture all this knowledge into the planning decision-making process. I think that's the biggest advantage of digitalization. So, and also was quite key thing about the importance of spatial planning. I think we are talking about two different things because digital planning is about digital and planning. So the number one issue is really about the importance of spatial planning as a discipline. I think that's the number one. We need to recognize the importance of that because the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they published a report last year, and then they give many different recommendations. One recommendation was spatial planning needs the largest systematic change as a key climate change adaptation option. So we need to unlock the full potential of spatial planning through digitalization. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities we have now to talk about digitalization.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Wei, for that. And Ewan, can you elaborate on the specific impacts of digitalization? Digitalization, it's a bit of a tongue twister, that, isn't it? But yeah, your perspective and how you envision the changes, maybe improving the process in the long term of planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to build on Wei's point, I think the important thing here is planning, right? I think the word digital kind of quite often gets that's secondary. That's just the medium. The key message is, look, planning is really important, and we need to make that work. And what's planning there for, right? In very, very simplistic forms, planning is there to kind of influence what we can build where, whether it's a rear extension on your house or a huge kind of urban extension outside Cambridge, right? That's what the planning system is there for. But the problem is today, it's very, very hard to figure out what you can build where. And that part of the reason for that is because all this information is within local authority websites, kind of embedded in kind of PDF documents, layers of legislation coming from central government policy, from central government guidance. It's really, really hard, right? This is why the whole profession of planning consultancy exists, because these are professionals that can find out what you can build where. And this is why I think the whole area is ripe for innovation, right? And this is why we're doing what we're doing, a block type, because we can help try and give some certainty, right? We can do the hard work. We can do the hard work in the background, try and understand the policy, understand the rules and regulations, and make it really easy for anyone. You don't have to be a professional to understand roughly what you can build where, because uncertainty is the number one issue that the planning system has. It makes local communities feel completely alienated. It means property developers don't know quite what they can build where, and it means that planners and local authorities are completely kind of tied to whatever kind of random opinion their political masters will lead, right, and end up making kind of some quite strange decisions in some cases. So I think if digitization and digitalization, whatever we call it, can overcome the barrier of certainty or uncertainty in the planning system, I think there'll be a huge step forward.
Okay, that's interesting, Ewan. Thanks very much. And Bridget, your perspective on that, please.
Yeah, I think just to build on the comments, what's really interesting is, we're talking here about system-wide change at both, from a challenges and also opportunities point of view. Kind of come back to a few points around accessibility, transparency. Ultimately, this is the value of tech applications in any context or sector, let alone planning and housing and wider regeneration. Particularly, we're looking at trying to create more certainty for stakeholders and ultimately a more efficient way of enabling planning to come to life. And just to ground us in a few of the examples that we talk about in our digital programs, talk about the sheer scale of change required. And while it's up to everyone on this call to kind of pitch in and help drive this sector forward, both inside and across the wider Geovation program, last year there were over 400,000 planning applications submitted, and 50% of those were invalid the second they were submitted. So 50% were invalid. And on average, and we know there's always a rule of thumb with average, it takes a planning officer 34 minutes to process an invalid application. So even with some quick maths on those numbers, there's clearly a very important and relevant and timely value proposition of why we all need to work together to drive this change forward, recognizing there are some challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about those barriers. But to your point, Ewan, some real opportunities to drive innovation and disruption through the use of digital technology to bring this information together, to standardize it, and to feed it back to ourselves, communities, and other stakeholders in a more efficient process.
That's great. Thank you, Bridget. Okay, we're going to move on to the next bucket of questions around barriers now. So it's a nice segue there. And as we're sticking with the digitalisation and digitalisation, I just thought I'd, sort of maybe spell out for those on the call. Digitalisation is perhaps the act of making analog data and information digital, whereas digitalisation, I see it as moving existing processes into digital technologies. So as we stick with that in our minds and as we navigate through the complex landscape of digitalisation and digitalisation in the planning industry, what do you identify as the most significant barriers to this transition? And yeah, back to you, Bridget, on that, please.
I'll start, but I'm really curious of what everyone else says on the panel and kind of where we go on this. We talk a lot about barriers in our world, Luke, because it's kind of, it's why we're here. It's about using the different levers and tools that government has, both from a policy perspective and a funding perspective, to really drive innovation and ultimately adoption of digital tools and practices forward. And I think sometimes those barriers are different depending on what tools and services we're talking about. Is it around the adoption of digital consultation platform, around new software or new standards, or new approaches to local plans, and or everything else in between? But just to share some of the kind of the big barriers that we're focusing on in our work, I think ultimately the first one's around level of investment required to either adopt, develop, or implement new digital tools and new ways of working, often across newly established multidisciplinary teams that reflects wider organisational and cultural practices and change management as well. That's not an insignificant barrier to unblock, but we hope that a lot of our funding directly to local authorities, and at last count we funded 80 local authorities across the entire digital planning program, shows that when that upfront investment is almost de-risked as part of the wider DLUC planning reform, we can really showcase the art of the possible and try and bring other stakeholders on the journey of what these outcomes could achieve, which I think ties into the next piece around generating the right evidence, showing the return on investment that then justifies and validates that buy-in at both an organisational and a team level to use the technology and the approaches and practices of technology in a way that has real legacy and sustainability, which speaks to the probably current lack of the biggest, I think, third challenge is a lack of interoperability. And I think, Richard, you mentioned this as well. We've got some brilliant products emerging across the marketplace, but unfortunately they don't they're not talking to each other. They're not sharing data in an open way yet. We hope that will evolve and change through different levers that across the sector we're all working on. But for us, it's around those kind of three pillars around supporting upfront investment R&D, standardising evidence and approaches to using technology, and then that wider piece of making sure these platforms and the data we're generating is linked up, and we're moving again to your point, Ewan, beyond information shared in PDFs, but in a much more open and system-wide approach.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. And I'm going to come across to you now, actually, Richard, then. So, the most significant barriers from your point of view and how they could potentially, how we can address those effectively.
I think that the big one Bridget's already mentioned is resource space. Obviously you've got planning departments now. I'm looking at this particularly from a public sector perspective as a public sector planner, but we're already in a position where we're sort of struggling with resource, and I think a lot of local authorities are. And I would say that the work that we've done, we've got a digital planning team in Camden, and that's becoming increasingly common, but that's because it's funded by central gov. So it is funded through this work we're working on, part of the Open Digital Planning Programme, which is delivering these points. And this goes, like I say, specifically one of the issues that is trying to address is these invalid applications and reducing those and those scopes. So without that support from central government, I think there's no way any of this progress would have been made. So that's absolutely crucial. And I think having some kind of like long-term and sustained viewpoint from local authority perspective and national perspective in order to ensure that these kind of things are resourced properly is absolutely crucial. It's a massive task we're trying to do here. It's not, it's not a small scale change. So it requires a lot of investment. And I think I think like attitudes to some extent, like kind of any transformation program can be difficult, but I think ultimately that can be managed. I'm not too concerned about that. I'm not too concerned about the skills specifically around digital skills and stuff within planners. I think that sort of comes, like they all seem to get on board with it. It's more about general, like the fact there aren't enough planners full stop is more the issue with that. So I think those, like, it's that resource is the big thing. And I think the interplay between public and private sector is key as well, and I think the government's doing quite a lot on that. And to trying to get the private sector, you've kind of got like two cohorts, as I see it, within the private sector. I'll probably be told I'm very wrong by private sector people, but from my perspective, the way I see it is you've got some really, really outdated, archaic legacy systems that are sitting there which have not evolved in, I'm not exaggerating here, 30 years. Like nothing's happened to them, and so it's quite clear that the private sector is not responding to any need there, and that's why there has to be this intervention for all these funded projects to try to progress things. And then on the other side, you've got these tech startups, which is the PropTech Fund is helping with, and things, who are doing like loads of amazing things, but actually a lot of what they do, they're limited and hamstrung somewhat by all of our old archaic systems and the fact that they don't have access to our data, and we can't, we're struggling to sort of unlock that data. And that's why it's so crucial that we bring all of the private sector along with us, not just the ones who are keen to like push, but we drag the ones who aren't so keen to come with us. And that needs government support really, which I think is there, but there's still resource issues across all of it.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yeah, so obviously calling out resources, one of the major barriers there. Ewan, I'm going to pass the baton over to you now to give your idea on that as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Bridget and Richard said, and I think kind of Richard kind of honed in on a really important issue, which is market failure, particularly in the back office systems which local authorities have. And the reason this is really important is Bridget touched on the 450,000 planning applications. I think last year was a bit low. The country processes. Now, every single planning application has got floor plans, has got transport impact assessments, infrastructure impact assessments. There's so much useful information out there. Right, but because all of this is kind of baked into these PDFs and stuck into these, as I said, 30-year-old back office systems that Richard touched on, it means that companies like mine, we can't access all this really, really valuable data. Right, so all of a sudden, this is why even government doesn't have access to the really data that it needs. It's buying data from Glenigan's and others, and so it means that kind of companies like mine, we kind of have to kind of mine the iron if we want to build a house, right? We have to do the whole thing, and that isn't efficient. That isn't productive, right? So I think there needs to be some major intervention into kind of the back office systems of local authorities, because there's no doubt that that's kind of a market failure. And I think behind that, though, there's also this cultural issue, right? Planners in general are a bit scared of digital. Maybe not Richard and kind of and the guys in Camden who are very forward thinking, but generally speaking, the 360 odd kind of planning authorities across the country, right? They're kind of a bit worried, and these big back office systems kind of say something, and they get a bit scared, and they get tied into 10-year licenses, right? Technology moves too fast. We can't be doing kind of 10-year licenses anymore. So I think there's a role here for government to actually kind of really intervene in the market and remove a lot of the smoke and mirrors around digital. Digital, as I said, kind of both Richard and I are planners by background, right? That's what and we've picked up digital. Anyone can pick up digital. It's not really that scary. But at the minute, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around that. So the cultural side of smoke and mirrors, the market intervention, and then after we do these two things, we'll be able to make all that huge amount of data that's being processed by local authorities available to startups, and then we can do some really interesting things.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So yeah, we've had a few great insights there. Wei, I'd like to pass over to you now for your perspective on that, please.
Thank you, Luke. I agree with what everybody have already said, but I think generally speaking, we see the biggest barriers we see digital and the planning as two different things. But I think we should naturally think planning should be digital in the 21st century. So we are missing that biggest opportunity. And we have a huge lack of skills and appreciation of how important digital transformation could bring to unlock the full potential of spatial planning. That's reflected in our education and also in the current skill sets of all the planners. Because if you look, majority of the workforce of the current planners, majority of them didn't have any proper digital training when they were trained as planners. So I think there's a huge task to upskill all. And also, in 2021, we carried out a comprehensive survey with local planning authorities and the planning schools in the UK. And then we realized actually there are lots of very valuable digital innovation relates to planning, but they are not necessarily done for planning. So it's highly fragmented. So it's really how we can share all this enormous, valuable knowledge and with planners and then to upskill the planners. I think there was a key issue about knowledge sharing as well. Because at the moment, if you see the whole digital market and the private sector, it's very fragmented. So many startups doing little interventions, but none of us is doing big transformational changes. I think this transformational change is what we need, as already other people talked about. So the purpose of the digital task force for planning is really try to create this platform. I describe the digital task force for planning is like a digital national trust. So we kind of provide a platform to share this knowledge so we can all benefit to advance the profession together. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are many very valuable research being done on climate change, on biodiversity, on many different areas, but they are being done maybe by engineers, by environmental specialists, by social scientists. But of course, they all have something to do with planning. But the research can be very theoretical. So it's not really applicable in planning directly. So what we want to focus is on the development part of R&D to see how all this very valuable research can be applied into mainstream planning practice, and also how we can influence the mainstream planning education. Because I think that relates to the decision making from our senior level, because quite a lot of senior planners or senior decision makers in planning schools, they are not equipped with digital skills. So it's for them, they are not very sure about what can be done. So digital training, for example, in many planning schools are still being kind of taught just in one module. It's not part of the whole program. But some universities, they're already trying to use digital as the mean to take planning course. So I think you can definitely see different trends in different universities. I think education is essential too. So there are many areas. I think we really have to think about the whole systems approach of how we can transform the whole planning profession into the digital era.
Absolutely, that's interesting. Thanks, Ewan. So, Bridget, having heard from the other three panelists, any other further thoughts around that from your side? Sorry, I'm not sure if we've got some lag on the line here. Certainly to my side, I was just bouncing it back because Bridget, you mentioned, love to hear from the other three panelists on that. And have you had any further thoughts now you've heard from them?
Oh, sorry, there was a lag there, Luke.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think I just, the fact that we all kind of built on each other's answers, but offered a quite different perspective speaks to the fact that this has to be a collective approach to solving this. We all represent different parts of the sector here with our own experiences inside and outside different levels of government and industry. And this requires us all to collaborate and to get creative, I think, on what are the sort of the practical skills parts, Richard, to your point around bringing the team in and on the journey, to funding those people to do the work, and to your point, Wei, around bringing wider stakeholders in as well. I think we have to have a much more collective and collaborative mindset of how we work together and recognize we all have a role to play. And, you know, completely agree, Ewan, central government has work to do. And I hope that what we're doing in digital planning, you know, can show some of that. Thank you for, you know, helping us set it up. But it can't be up to one stakeholder here to drive the change, because it is such a sheer scale of challenge, but also opportunity as well.
Sure. Any other final comments from the panel on that side in terms of the barriers and how we're going to overcome them? If not, we can move on. Ewan, anything else?
No, I was just gonna. I think there's a really good point in the comments around the need for standardization, right? Because remember that the planning system, again, for good and bad, the planning system in this country is devolved to local authorities, and they're the ones doing it, right? People like Richard are and they're the ones that kind of control a lot of it. Government does have kind of some key levers like legislation, which is, there's really exciting things coming across in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill about planning. But when it comes down to it, it's the local authorities. So how can you get kind of local authorities together to be working off the same plane, particularly given that there's such kind of discrepancy between them, right? So local authorities like Camden are kind of pushing ahead, kind of doing really amazing stuff with their own open data platforms. But there's other local authorities, which I won't name, which are just kind of still kind of unsure if there's any benefit for them. They're saying, look, we have digitized because they've got PDFs and email.
Yeah, so it's that consistency. Richard, sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like come in on that point. I mean, yeah, I think it's absolutely key to it, and I think one thing that is probably underrated with sort of with DLUC's role in like kind of, there's a lot of focus on the funding that they put in, and resourcing is incredibly important, as we've already said. But what I would say is a major thing that the intervention that government's had in this, which has been a really positive impact and will continue to be, particularly on things like the standards, like Ewan says, it builds from the people who are just trying to do the work, they emerge, is that all of that funding and the whole nature of the way that everything's worked from DLUC, which has been really positive on it, has been about collaboration and about actually getting local authorities to work with one another. Now, 10 years ago, I didn't really work with people in other local authorities. I mean, I knew, planning's a small world. You sort of know people. You don't really work with other local authorities on projects, and it just didn't really happen that much. And even in London, where we're all under kind of the GLA umbrella, that now happens. I know people in Bucks and Newcastle, and we're these whole groups of local authorities all working together to the same aim, establishing standards, saying, well, how do you record that bit of information? We do it like that. Well, why don't we do it and agreeing these emerging data standards? And then you've got like Paul Downey's team, which Ewan was in, which is then talking to all of them and going, all right, well, how about you do it like this, and guiding us in a way which sort of helps us in advising us and things. That role actually has been, absolutely crucial, and it's been like alongside the funding element of it, that idea of kind of getting local authorities talking to one another and creating like a collaborative environment where they work alongside suppliers, central gov and everything to try and establish those standards has been really important, and that is the thing that will push the wall up. Well, it will at least build the foundations to allow those kind of like legacy providers of back office systems to try and basically go like, look, guys, this is what you need to be doing. This is where we are now, and it will allow us to sort of get to that stage. So I think that, that point around kind of a standardized approach and an agreed data standard across different bits of information is really important. It's crucial, and it's the foundations on which we'll build the entire digitalisation of planning, really.
Fantastic, Richard. Thanks for calling it out, and obviously, collaboration being the key word there for me that jumped out. So we're going to move on to the final section here now around innovation. So the question is, and I'm going to come to you first, Wei, for this one. Could you discuss some of the most exciting innovations you've seen or predict in the space, and how you might think these innovations will shape the future of the planning and development?
Thank you, Luke. I originally prepared the answer I thought was participatory GIS. I think that's a very powerful tool. because I think engaging public is a quite important function for planning. We need to make sure the public on our side, the community are engaged. But quite often, it's only just about 1% of the community they engage with traditional public consultation events. So it's really how to get the other majority, the quiet majority on board. So I think participatory GIS is a good way to really engage community so they can really provide their how they use space on a day-to-day basis. So they don't necessarily join the public participation event, but actually they can provide their data, they can share how they use the space on a daily basis. So we can use this big data to help us inform how our places of spaces are being used in different areas. So I think that's a very useful innovation for planning. But also I think we need to think about the function of planning as well. Reflect to the question we discussed earlier, because quite often people perceive planning as part of the administrative process. So it's really about planning applications. But I think planning is also about our relationship with natural environment and with our society. So at the moment, we have the grand challenges we are facing. So there are lots of different departments, for example, like DEFRA and other departments, they were talking about develop a land use framework. So whether that's a function for planning or not, but if we do have this common spatial data environment, and if we do have a common mapping system within the whole country, and then all the different authorities, we don't have to invent your own standard to try to say how we can get the data from different departments. Because from our survey, we realized even within the same local planning authority, data are not shared between different departments. So if we could create this common spatial data environment, not only in England, but actually for the whole UK, or eventually I think we can build this for the whole world. And then we can really share this information seamlessly between the boundaries. Because the boundaries doesn't exist. A boundary doesn't exist. It's only our administrative boundary. So I think this is the whole scope of spatial planning, how we can consider spatial planning from a totally different perspective, and including the rural planning as well, and also agricultural, because it's not being considered integratively as well.
Okay, thank you, Wei. I'm going to come over to you, Ewan, now. Any exciting innovations you've seen or predict? And
Yeah, I mean,
really
absolutely.
use it?
I mean, by far, block type is probably the most interesting thing happening in the market right now. No, I'm joking. I think it's interesting. We're now kind of entering the third kind of generation of kind of the digital planning, which is still very nascent kind of market. The first generation was our iDocs and our kind of the really early things in the 90s were took paper into PDFs, right? So that happened. That was the first generation of kind of innovation, kind of in the digital planning world. Now the second generation, which is kind of is people who've been taking all these PDFs and turning them into data and making the data available, right? Whether that's kind of land tech, search land, right? There's loads of people there who are taking a lot of that information and make it available. But now what we're seeing this third generation, which is taking that data and making it useful and making it intelligent. And this is what we do at BlockType, right? We don't harvest data. We use the data that other people are making available and give it to people so it's actually useful and you can do smart things with it. So I think you can see how kind of this thing is progressing. And I think there's a whole number of different kind of startups in the area that are doing kind of very similar things, taking data and making it really, really targeted at the users, whether it's property developers, whether it's local communities, etc.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks, Ewan. And Bridget, could you add your views on that as well?
I think we're all fairly aligned here. The aggregation and the visualization, to your point, Wei, of planning data, feedback, outcomes, however we frame it. I think, that there's some really interesting innovations coming through, both in the PropTech Fund and kind of wider sector as well. And also, I think we're still kind of peering over the edge of the cliff saying what else is out there, because it seems like, there is a wider kind of wave of change coming. And kind of to break that down to two kind of areas, I think speak to both your points, Wei and Ewan, that piece around aggregation, and whether it's language models. And I don't think we have a question on ChatGPT yet, like maybe it's implied in some of these, it's kind of these moments of time, isn't it, as a sector to step back and go, well, what is the impact of of these types of software becoming more accessible and used in a variety of contexts, planning being one of them. And, you know, how do we stay curious and creative on the role of those technologies to support us to, going back to the earlier point, become more efficient, productive and transparent? And so the latest round of funding in the PropTech Fund, we've got a whole cohort working on the use of AI to process planning representations for a local plan, because we know that some local authorities, despite best intents and purposes, you know, are bogged down manually processing Excel spreadsheets for up to 12 months. And so we talk about fast tracking the plan making process. It seems like there could be some easy wins there with using language models or smart analytics to bring that data together and visualize it. And then it goes the other point around sharing it back to the community, visualizing it. And I think, Wei, to your point, you know, making it spatially referenced is such an exciting area opportunity. Again, we've got a whole cohort working on that, and we'd love to share more as it evolves. But I think it speaks to the wider conversation we need to have as a sector around the trade-offs of land use. I'm not sure if people saw the Geospatial Commission on Common Ground, Finding Common Ground land report was published last week across energy, water, housing, and speaks to, I think, the use of these tools that, you know, we're funding in a planning and housing context, but probably could be applied to other sectors as well. You bring those two together, I think you can have some very interesting conversations and outcomes along the way.
Great, thanks, Bridget. And could you tell us more about the PropTech Fund as well, in terms of who it's aimed at and timings, etc., around that?
Of course, so we're up to round 3 of the PropTech Fund, and we've actually got a showcase event on next week. If I can do a cheeky plug, happy to put a link in the chat. If anyone wants to hear and learn more, we're doing that showcase event next Wednesday. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 18 months, over 3.5 rounds of funding, we've been absolutely blown away by the level of demand from both local authorities and the tech sector to work together to, you know, to your point, Richard, collaborate and figure out and answer questions around, does this stuff work? How do we make it scalable? And how do we make it accessible for all in terms of communities and wider stakeholders? So over the last 18 months, we've been trying to answer questions around what are the barriers to adopting these digital tools in practice? How do we accelerate the adoption of these tools in different planning and regeneration contexts and urban environments, both within statutory planning and also alongside it? How do we get creative? How do we use in-person engagement alongside digital to create a more hybrid and inclusive approach to engagement? And now the latest round of funding is, as I was mentioning, looking at how we create a more efficient process for responding and undertaking consultations, whether through using artificial intelligence and standardizations to work through that data and feedback, or to visualize the art of the possible and inform communities and stakeholders on the wider trade-offs inherent in, you know, spatial planning and development. So in terms of the future rounds of funding, I can't sit here with a hand on heart and say what that looks like or when that will be. But as always, we're looking at how we can use the current momentum and the evidence generated to support further business cases for this area of work alongside the wider digital planning program as well.
Great, thank you, Bridget. That's useful to know. Okay, and Richard, now for this the final question that we just covered with the other 3 panelists there, could you share your views on, you know, the most exciting innovations that you've seen or predict in the space and how you think they're going to shape the future of the planning process?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously block type's up there, but I think there's, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff out there actually that's really good. I think it's very limited. I mean, a lot of it's not like the really cool stuff that people look at necessarily, but I think it's got really massive impact. And this comes back to the things like, so you go and look at things like commonplace and stuff. I mean, the fact is it's a really useful way of structuring and aggregating consultation feedback, and we're not used to that in planning historically. You're sort of manually going through sometimes what can be, you know, several A4 pages of sort of like a some kind of stream of consciousness, normally an objection, and actually structuring it in ways that also combine it with things like geographical data in terms of like kind of where's it come from. You can start to kind of like geofence bits of like demographic data that's collected with it and things. It's a lot richer data, and we don't have that for planning applications yet. And that's just because of the way that that we access that data and the way that we're able to consult on that data. One of the products that plug from Camden as well. One of the things we've been working on is our digital site notices. Again, the work with that was funded through DLUC funding. Where we have actually done that, we've used our open data portal. It connects into that, so it's not a bespoke kind of made up consultation. It's just using data, and it's using structured data, and we've kind of created our data standards that we're using for that. And what that also now looks at, not only does it communicate a development in a way that people actually want to understand and try and broaden engagement, so they don't have to look through those PDFs. They've just got the information there that they want to see. It looks at how we can collect the data, the consultation feedback in a more structured way, sort of mimicking the likes of things like Commonplace. And that allows that aggregation of data again. If you standardise that, you don't need to look at local authority boundaries. You can look across the whole country. You can start to collect data in that standardised, structured way for consultations, and that's what we're going to be hoping to do next. There's also loads of stuff out there that's really useful that we use all the time, like things like the View City, having and they're constantly adding tools. I mean, just understanding, looking at kind of buildings over 18 meters high and things like that for thresholds. When we had to start looking at fire safety regulations, where you can just like lift planes up kind of 18 meters and see what buildings pop out and things like that. Now doing that manually, like narrowing that search with that digital tool, was just is so much quicker than if you were to do that in any other sort of manual way. Just like small innovations like that, and you can see that clearly going to sort of a combination with our digital site notices, for example. If you start to combine that, you can start to have things like VR and augmented reality and things like that for consultation, so people can actually see it there in situ, and that becomes a kind of a much greater kind of engagement tool, I think, and involves people who wouldn't normally maybe get involved in planning decisions. And I think the other stuff there is, there are these kind of AI systems and machine learning systems being used for things like validating planning applications and things like that. And I think ideally you'd like to move beyond the need to do that, because to an extent you might need to use it. We have to have drawings, right? We need plans and things, so you need to find ways of doing that. But ideally we'd like to move beyond the point where you need it for much of kind of submissions to deal with that invalid issue that Bridget was talking about before. Well, actually we can hopefully move beyond that. But the fact is that as a stopgap to kind of say, well, at the moment we're still getting all of our submissions in this way that isn't structured. Well, actually, the technology's there and being used for it. So I see it being used differently in the future. I don't think we'll need it for that. I think we'll move to a more structured submission system and using those data standards, which is what the ODP, which is Open Digital Planning Programme, is all about, trying to sort that out. But it will focus that in. So I think I can still see the use of that for things like collecting data and things like that. But I think that idea of kind of aggregating data and making it more standardized is only going to make kind of a lot of these products that are already out there and already doing really effective jobs, it's going to only kind of focus them and allow them to be a lot more powerful, actually, in the future. I think one thing I would say is that, which is probably a thing, but I suppose one of my concerns around all of this is around, it always comes back to resource and things like that, and how we do it, and the pressure, I think, from local government, from the public sector in general, local government, central government funding. Often the pressure is to say that, well, hang on a minute, what we need to do in order to sort of, to ensure that this works, we need to show a financial return somehow. And I think there's always a risk that we don't think about, well, actually, some things might not make money, and that doesn't mean they're necessarily bad in themselves. A more open system that gives us better outcomes for, like Wade was saying, around the importance of kind of environmental impact and things. What some of these systems will give us is much more effective monitoring, for example, of how successful climate interventions have been, whether that's through kind of urban greening or carbon reductions, and looking at that kind of be seen, that last level of the energy hierarchy, how we monitor that and the success of that and the implementation of that and things like that, you know, those are really valuable. And obviously, if we get an overall, it comes back to like Always' general point actually around like the entire, you know, we need to sit back and look at the system as a whole, right? Planning is around, ultimately, if it's working properly, it is delivering growth and it's delivering jobs and it's delivering homes and it's doing those things. And so maybe the financial benefit isn't from the bit you put in at the beginning, like you know, reinvesting itself. Maybe the financial benefit is from the economic growth that comes out at the end point. So I think we do need to step back a bit, but it's really difficult because of the way that public sector finances are structured. So I think you know, and that's like on a local and a national level. But I think it's something it's difficult to manage it. But I think we have to never lose sight of what we're trying to do and what the economic benefits of the planning system should be in of themselves anyway.
I think that's a really great way to finish the panel and the questions, at least anyway, Richard. So yeah, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the four of you for joining us. Unless there are any sort of pressing concluding remarks from any one of you, then we can look to finish that today. So just a final few words from myself here, just to plug a couple of things that are coming up through Geovation. So next week we have our awards ceremony, the Geovation Innovation Awards. Our ceremony takes place in central London at the Chartered Accountants Hall in 1 Moorgate. It's on Thursday the 15th. There are still just a handful of tickets available for in person. We've nearly sold out, but it's going to be essentially, yeah, an award ceremony celebrating everything that geography and geospatial does in terms of addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, for those that you can't come physically, please do join us online. We're going to have an online version too. So my colleague will be sharing the link to that Eventbrite in the chat shortly, if they haven't done so already. So yeah, that's a major thing for us next week. In terms of our accelerator program, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we run these 2 tracks of accelerator, one on PropTech and one on Geotech. And each and every 6 months we have a call looking for startups to respond to that and apply. So the next call will be opening in July and usually runs for 6 to 8 weeks. So if that's of interest, do have a look for it. If it's someone you might know, please do share the call. All of that promotion is really appreciated. The next positive impact panel we're running on the 25th of July. So just plugging that one whilst we have people on the call here. It's this one will be exploring digital twins in the construction industry. So keep your eyes peeled on our socials for that and the Eventbrite, etc., to sign up to that one. And we will be sending an email out to all of you attending today with more details of these things anyway. So do have a look out for the email. So that's it from me, and that's it from the panel. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Wei. Thank you, Richard and Ewan. It's been a fascinating insight into the subject area. And I'd like to hope you have a good rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Take care, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.